Welcome to this presentation on drones and data protection in the humanitarian context. This presentation is given in the context of a training delivered by the World Food Programme on the use of drones in emergency response that is funded by the European Union Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid. The agenda of the presentation is the following. We'll start with an introduction of data protection and privacy. We'll then move on to generally what we should know as UAS or drone pilots. We'll talk about the basics of data protection so that we understand the terms that are widely used in this realm. Then we'll move on to the data protection principles, have some honorary mentions of concepts that can be useful in this exercise, and then move on to some practical advice for UAS users in emergency response. So what is data protection and why are we talking about it? Data protection stems from the right to privacy. The right to privacy is a right that has been established by many international regulations, frameworks, but also on a regional and national level. Most notably, the right to privacy has been included as a right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Article 12 of the Declaration states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family home, or correspondence. This right has been celebrated, endorsed, and enforced in many different ways, most notably recently with the introduction of new technologies, with the internet, with social media, with artificial intelligence, and with drones. The right to privacy has a prominent role when we're talking about protection of people's rights when using these technologies. The drones have revolutionized various industries, including aerial photography, surveying, delivery services, and of course, humanitarian response. And this is why we're talking about this here. Drones is used widely in the work of the United Nations, of the World Food Programme, or different NGOs, governments use drones for various reasons. Drones, however, collect and process a significant amount of data, including images, videos, location information, and sensor data. A lot of this data is considered personal data, and therefore their misuse could interfere with people's right to privacy. As already mentioned, it is crucial to protect this data to maintain privacy, but also to foster trust and comply with regulations. This means that we take all the precautions necessary to ensure that our use of technology and our efforts to deliver our aid or do our work in a more efficient way does not interfere with people's rights, and in particular, the right to privacy. What should you know as a drones pilot then when it comes to data protection and the right to privacy? Number one, pilots must be aware of the need to protect people's personal data. That is the most basic understanding that we need to have when we're flying our drones. We also need to familiarize ourselves with any applicable local, national, international laws that govern data protection, data privacy, security, and drone operations. This is part of any sort of training, drones training, license training that we need to take. So hopefully as a drone pilot, we should be familiar with these regulations and these frameworks. And finally, we should understand how our use of drones may interfere with people's right to privacy. So basically put number 1 and 2 into action and ensure that we respect people's privacy. Let's talk about the basics here. I understand that all the talk about data protection regulations, about rights, about laws can be quite daunting. So let's just define some terms that will help us understand what we need to know, or the basics of what we should know about data protection and the use of drones. The most important definition obviously here is what constitutes personal data. The definition widely used is that personal data is basically any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to a specific identifier. Now, what does that mean? Personal data generally is anything that can be used directly or indirectly to identify an individual. So when we're talking about the use of drones, that would mean any sort of picture, video, location that can be used to identify a specific natural person. When we're talking about processing of personal data, what do we mean by processing? Processing is any operation or set of operations conducted over personal data or sets of personal data, whether or not by automated means such as collection, recording, organization, structuring, storage, adaptation, or alteration, etc. So again, with simple words, processing means anything that we do with the data. It can also be just storing the data, it can be transferring the data. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is something that is manually done, but it can also be an automatic processing of data. And as we know, drones tend to do some automatic processing of data, so that would fall under what we mean when we talk about processing. Finally, data subjects. Data subjects is basically the people whose personal data is processed. So in this case, if we're using drones, flying over a community of people, and we are taking video of the community, then the data subjects would be the people of the community, the people who can be identified on the video. Now we're coming to the meat of this presentation, data protection principles. Why are these important, and why are we going to dedicate some time on this? So data protection regulations, data protection frameworks, practices vary from place to place slightly. Generally, we have some standards that everyone is following, but most importantly, we have some common data protection principles. The reason why I want to introduce these principles here is because I genuinely think that these are the most important tools for drones pilots when it comes to the use of this technology in the field. I imagine that people will not be thinking about laws or trying to recite articles from different regulations, but rather they will be thinking about the general principles, the general things that they need to have in mind when flying their drones, when processing data or personal data rather with their drones. So these are the main data protection principles: fair and legitimate processing of data, purpose specification, data quality, data minimization, security and confidentiality, retention, accountability, transfers of data, and transparency. So we'll take them one by one and discuss them a little bit. Fair and legitimate processing. What do we mean by that? Fair and legitimate processing means that we need to have a legal basis for the processing of personal data. Most of you will be familiar with the concept of using consent as a legal basis, consent by the data subjects, that is, to ensure that when we're processing their data, we are covered, and the people are aware and aligned in terms of the processing of their data. However, that is not the only legal basis that can be used to process personal data. We have multiple grounds on which we can process personal data. One of them is the legitimate interest of the organization that is processing the data, and that is closely linked to the mandate of our organization. Talking about the World Food Program here, our mandate is to deliver food and aid to people. And so that gives us a legitimate interest to process personal data to achieve that goal. That being said, that cannot be used as a blanket approval for any processing of personal data. When we're using legitimate interest as the legal basis for which we process personal data, we need to conduct a balancing exercise between the legitimate interest of the organization, but also the rights and the freedoms of the data subject. So basically, in simple words, that means that we need to balance the mandate of the organization, the need to deliver the mandate, but at the same time ensuring that people's rights will not be violated in that process by processing their personal data. Another legal basis is public interest, or it can be for the vital interests of the data subject. So in case of life or death, again, in terms of emergency response, that can be relevant. Now, obviously, there is a lot of academic debate. There is a lot of regulation on this matter. So we can, that there is a lot of further reading that one can do to understand legal basis better. But for the purposes of this training and this presentation, I think the most important thing to note is that we need to have a legal basis for the processing of people's personal data. One of them is consent, another one is legitimate interest, vital interest of the data subject. But again, we do not need to determine that at this point or go into too much detail. The second principle is purpose specification. What this means is that we need to have a very good reason and a very specific purpose for the processing of personal data. So what that means, giving the example of the processing of personal data with drones, we cannot just fly drones around, taking video, processing people's personal data with no specific purpose. If, for example, we are in a search and rescue mission, which is something that is discussed in the context of the training developed by the World Food Programme for the use of drones, then that gives us a specific purpose for the processing of data, because the drones are going out there to find people, and they're taking video and pictures of people who need to be rescued from a natural emergency or whatever the case may be. So this purpose needs to be clearly specified, and this purpose needs to be codified in a way so that we adhere to this principle. Then we have data quality. Very simple, data needs to be accurate. When processing data, we need to ensure that the data we're processing is accurate and that it is maintained accurate. So this does not necessarily apply that much to processing of personal data by drones, but it is very important to ensure that the quality of data is maintained, to ensure that people's rights are also protected. If something changes, then the database of personal data should be updated to ensure that people are not discriminated against, or in the case of humanitarian aid, if someone's, for example, if someone's address changes and then the address is not changed in the database, people may not be able to receive the aid that they need. Another very famous data protection principle is data minimization. This means that we should simplify, as the chief here is indicating, simplify the data that we are processing. If we do not need to process certain data sets or specific personal data categories, then we should just not do it. We should only process the necessary personal data to fulfill the purpose that has been defined, the purpose that we've talked about before in purpose specification. No more data should be collected, no more data should be processed. Security and confidentiality pertains to the IT security mostly these days, so we need to make sure that we use safe and secure IT security methods when, for example, when uploading data from our drones, when we're using different software to process the data, we need to make sure that the tools that we use are safe and secure and they follow industry standards. Retention, something that is very common is that we process personal data, we collect personal data, and then the data is kept around forever. And that obviously increases the risks to data subjects because it is not just the amounts of data that we collect, but it's also how long we keep it for. If we keep the data forever, then the duration of keeping the data increases also the risk profile. Therefore, when we start a project, we should determine how long the data that we're collecting or that we're processing should be retained for. We should have a specific retention schedule. The next one is accountability. They are just different roles and responsibilities that are very clearly defined in the regulations that we have on data protection. Some of these roles you may be familiar with is, for example, the controller of data. The controller is the entity that determines the means and the purpose for the processing of personal data. In many cases, this would be the organization that is collecting the data, that is processing the data. Another role is a processor. So in the case of processing personal data with drones for emergency response, the international organization that is operating the drones or the government will be the controller. The processor is the entity that follows the controller's instructions. So it could be the software company, it could be an NGO that is processing the data on behalf of the organization, etc. Again, you don't need to worry too much about the technicalities and the details here, but you should rather be aware that there are different roles and responsibilities, and depending on the roles, we have different accountability. Transfers of data is something that we also discuss a lot in data protection literature, and that is because it's all good and nice when you process data within your own network, within your own environment, but things change when we transfer data from one entity to the other, from one country to the other. Because there are different regulations, there are different standards, there are modalities by which we transfer the data that need to follow the same standards. And that is done by basically ensuring that the modality that is used and the place to which the transfer is done follows the same or same level of standards as the original party that is processing the data. And finally, transparency. I've touched upon this a little bit when I was talking about the legal basis. Transparency is the principle that states that we have to be sure that our data subjects are aware of the processing of their personal data, and that, as I am sure you're all very familiar, is done in many different ways. One of them is by asking for people's consent. Another way is a privacy notice. We can have posters, we can have audio, video communications, just to ensure that people are aware of the processing of their personal data. In the context of the use of drones, this means, or this could mean, the international organizations broadcasting either via video or with the different communication methods that specific communities may have, that we are using drones, that we are collecting personal data for the specific and the specified purpose. And it could be emergency response, it could be to do search and rescue, to do mapping, etc. Now that we've gone through the data protection principles, which, as I said, is the meat and the most important part of the presentation, we'll have a couple of honorary mentions. So these are concepts that you can be aware of, that you should be aware of, but not necessarily know in depth. Or rather, if you're interested, you can look into it further on your own. So the first one I mentioned is data subject rights. These data protection regulations that we've discussed previously have also given rise to data subject rights. This means that data subjects, so the people whose data we are processing, have certain rights when it comes to the processing of their personal data. One of the rights, as we've already discussed, is transparency, that we need to be we need to make sure that people are aware of what we're doing with their data, but also they have the right to object to the processing of their personal data. They need to have information and access to their personal data, and they have a right to ask for the rectification and erasure, or otherwise known as the right to forget from the data controller, or let's say in this case, the international organization. So that means that we need to ensure that we allow and we have a mechanism in place for the data subjects to exercise their rights. Often this is something that we do through our complaints and feedback mechanisms, or or we have emails or telephone numbers, or whatever the case may be, so that data subjects can reach out and they can exercise these rights. They can ask for their data to be deleted. They can ask for their data to be modified, etc. Second honorary mention is the PIA. Again, something that I'm sure you are aware of to an extent. A PIA is a privacy impact assessment. This is basically a risk assessment for data protection. And I'll just go very quickly through the components of this PIA, just so that you are aware of its different components. The first is scope and purpose. So we have a bit of a background in the PIA of the data processing of the project, etc. We have a section on data collection and use. So what data are we collecting, for what purpose, etc. There is a component for compliance with internal regulations or external regulations, depending on the context in which we perform this assessment. We make sure that stakeholders are engaged, as I discussed previously, making sure that people's rights are upheld, but also that different stakeholders like community leader or NGOs or civil society are engaged. We assess the privacy risks and their impact, produce mitigation measures or suggest mitigation measures, and we have an action plan to implement the mitigation measures. A privacy impact assessment is a living document, so it is something that should be reviewed and updated often. Finally, I will leave you with some practical advice that you can take with you and think about when processing personal data with the use of drones in emergency response. First of all, simply put, the most effective way of protecting personal data is not collecting it. So if you can, just avoid processing personal data. If it is not necessary for the purpose of your project, if, for example, you're doing mapping of buildings, there is no need to process personal data. Therefore, just fly higher and capture images and videos from angles that people cannot be identified. In that way, you avoid the need to protect the personal data and worry about all that we've discussed in this presentation. Secondly, ensure that you follow IT security best practices. This is going to go a long way. Make sure that you use encryption, that you're processing and storing data with trusted systems and tools, and save personal data in trusted databases. As discussed, one way to make sure that you're not going to encounter any issues with people's privacy is to be open about it and transparent and talk to people, sensitize communities before flying drones. When people see drones flying above them, they usually get agitated or suspicious. So it is the easiest way to ensure that people will not fear for their right to privacy is to talk to them about the purpose of your project and let them know that you will be flying drones that will be capturing personal data. Proportionality, we need to always balance the purpose of the exercise with the rights of the people. We need to make sure that when processing personal data, we take into account any risks that we may be exposing people to. Training and awareness. So This is obviously a staple. We always need to make sure that we're on top of our game in terms of our training and awareness of new regulations and new um, obligations that we may have as UAS pilots. And finally, the last practical advice that I will leave you with is to only use drones for the right purposes and when needed. If we are just delivering food in an area, then we do not need to be flying drones just to take a nice video of the delivery of food. We need to think about the repercussions of flying drones, of processing personal data with drones, and think about whether using drones is the best way forward. The presentation, I'm just going to point you to some extra reading that you can have. It's always interesting to see what the ICRC is saying with the personal data, as they have produced the handbook on data protection and humanitarian action, and there is mention of using emerging technologies and drones in particular. We have a couple of authorities like the EASA and ICAO that always give a lot of guidance and a lot of useful materials, and of course the UAviators Code of Conduct. So thank you very much for your attention for this presentation. If you have any questions, thoughts or feelings, then please feel free to leave a comment to this video or to reach out to our team, and we'll be very happy to discuss or to share any resources that may help you with your inquiry. Thank you very much.